Hi, it's me, Pat, again, up here in the attic, and I wanted to go over the business side of farming because a lot of people get into farming and they think of it as a hobby. And even if you don't make your living off of the farm, I don't consider it a hobby. Maybe you want to call it a lifestyle, but if you want to turn it into a business, don't demean it by calling it your hobby farm, even if it's 2 acres, even if it's an acre and a half, even if it's just a little backyard in the urban zone. If you're trying to make money off of it, it's not a hobby, it's a business. Okay? Now, as far as the size of a herd that can make some money, if you've got one or two does that are really productive and you can make soap for sale, that's a business and that's a size that works for you. I have 60 in my herd right now. That's a little more than I wanted to have. Sales weren't so good this year. So some of my does are being bred and they will be sold as either bred does or as milking does in milk once they freshen in the spring. But I think we've been pretty much a production herd um, since we've been about 10 years old. I think it took us 5 years to turn a profit, but to actually be looking at production took us about 10 years. Prior to that, it was like, we just want to break even. But then we went from we want to break even to we need to make a profit and these goats need to pay for themselves. And so that's where we turned into a production herd. We had been on test, we'd been showing, and I'd been doing more with making soap, not as much as I do now. And it really is a juggling act. But you can do it if you want to. Okay? If you're going to be in the business of farming, then you probably need to go to your town and do one or two things depending upon the town you live in. If you live in a city, you may need to go and get a variance. Um, you need to possibly go get a variance to make sure that you are allowed to have your animals on your property. But assuming that that's taken care of, you'll need to file a tax document that says you are operating as a farm, as a business. In my town, I have to do that every 10 years, every 5 or 10 years, I forget. I just did it last year. You also have to file with the state to get a sales tax ID number. I actually use my social security number. If you were really trying to save money, then you probably want to try and get your land in some sort of protection. In Massachusetts, we have what's called 61, Chapter 61, which is production land. It can be 61B, which is forest land, or 61A, which is land which is actually being tilled or being grazed. And what that does is it gives me a bit of a break, and I mean a bit, not a lot, on my land tax, on my property tax. But if I take my land out of production, if I'm no longer farming, then I am liable for the tax difference. Or if I sell my farm to somebody else who decides to not farm, they will lose that protection. And I need to file a tax form every year. It does save me a bit. In my property, in my area, I have to have a minimum of 5 acres in production. So if I have a 5 acre property and 2.5 acres are being saved as residential, which they do, and I don't know why, then only 3.5 of my acres are open for the 61A. I actually own more than 10 acres, so 8.5 acres of my land are in production. Either primary or secondary. And by that, I mean some of it's in prime use, being used all the time. Some of it is there in reserve for if I need to expand the pasture, if I need to like cut down the trees and turn them into an orchard. It's land that is protected, but not at the same rate as the primary land protection. Now, there are other protections you can put on your land There are conservation restrictions, also called CRs. There are conservation easements, and then there are APRs. An APR is the actual selling of your agricultural rights to the state or the county. In Massachusetts, you sell it to the state, in which case all of your land that is in protection is taxed at a different rate. You can never develop that land other than for agricultural purposes, in which case, if you've got 40 acres, you might want to take out 5 acres, and that's your homestead and space to build an additional house on for another family member, something like that. But that is in perpetuity. A conservation restriction is an agreement for a certain amount of time, oftentimes 5 years or maybe 10 or 15, where your land is kept open, it is not developed. You can take it out of that restriction, though. A conservation easement is similar to a conservation restriction, but I believe easements travel with the land rights. Restrictions do not travel with the land rights, so that if you sell your property and it's in restriction, if it's got a conservation restriction on it, that restriction is only for 5 or 10 years, and then the new owners can break that. An easement goes with the property and stays there, and it will need to be adjudicated if you're going to break the easement. I believe that's how that goes. But there are all ways that you can ease your tax burden, and in some ways, maximize your flexibility. If you've got a large piece of property and you're really going to be practicing agricultural practices and not just raising a few goats in the backyard, you may want to go to the U.S. Soil Conservation Service and have them assess your property, take a look at where are the wetlands you need to deal with, what type of environmental concerns are you dealing with. Really, if you have soils that are protected, those are usually soils that are highly productive, and in New England, very rare. When we bought our property, we had to go to our conservation district, our conservation board, and show how we were going to live within the confines of the land that we have. We have rock, we have wetland. How are we going to keep our goats? And I can tell you that it was kind of a comical situation. The commission has changed a great deal in 20 years. But when we first wanted to put our barn at where it kind of sort of is right now, it was on a high point. And we live on an area where we are on the ridge. Animals, effluents, urine, manure that's on this side of the ridge goes to one watershed. Things on this side of the ridge go to another watershed. But on either side of us are very large trees that extend for hundreds of feet, in some cases thousands of feet before you get to the water. But they were concerned that the manure and the urine was going to pollute the reservoir. Now, those trees should take up any nutrients that pass from the goats, but they were concerned about that. So we said, fine, we will move the barn to the back property out of the watershed protection area, out of any wetland setback and buffer zone. And they said, oh no, we can't make you move that far. You can just move it a little bit. So we moved it 5 feet and actually moved it closer to one set of wetlands than where it was. And they said that was okay. Also, if we had called that a garage instead of a barn, and we put our animals in the garage along with the car, we could have changed oil in there and not had a problem. But the urine and the manure was a concern for them, not the pollution. So you need to find out how aware your conservation commission or district is. Now, I am still tempted, after all these years, to go back to the Soil Conservation Service and say, can I take this out of the protection of the Conservation Commission and make adjustments to the topography of the land? They tried to put 10 houses on our 10 acres of land, and they weren't able to perk them. So as a consequence, we have test pits all over the front part of the property. If those test pits could be combined into a pond, if that is going to be a moving pond, and we happen to have a vernal pool near us, as well as a vernal stream, if we were to live with the fact that that vernal pond and vernal stream is there, we may be able to adjust the pond to allow the vernal stream to become more perpetual, and then have another piece of living wetland rather than a test pit which just collects water and mosquitoes. So you need to look at your farm from an environmental standpoint. You also have to look at some real concerns. Where are you going to stockpile your manure? What are you going to do with the bedding? In our case, we have a manure pile, but it is more than 50 feet away from our well. And it is not near the vernal stream or the vernal pool. So we have to be careful how we manage that. You also have to consider down the road, you will have dead animals on your property. So you have to make some plans as to how you're going to deal with that. Cremation is an option, but taking them to the vet all the time, when you're a production herd and having your vet pay for them to dispose of, that gets really expensive. So those are some things that you can do to ease your tax issue. And then you actually come to keeping your books. And the cost of your original stock, the cost of any breeding services, the cost of any medical services, feed or hay, electrical if you want to be fussy. If you live on town water, your town water bill. But you would have to prorate that for what does the barn use versus your house. All of those things are tax deductible. Also, if you are going to a market to sell your goods, whether it's goat meat or cheese or milk or soap or whatever, all of those become tax deductible as well. So to some extent, a lot of your overhead will become tax deductible. But you have to run a profit at some point in time. You can't write it all off as loss, because the IRS will come down on you and say, you are operating a loss for 20 years. You're not operating a business. So you have to look at this as a business, okay? If you have storage fees, say you have to rent a AI tank, or you rent part of an AI tank, all of that, AI meaning artificial insemination, not artificial intelligence, that is part of it. So, and your profit comes in from, or your sales at least, maybe not your profit, hopefully, but your sales comes from your livestock sales, from any winnings that you have, if there are premiums at a show. As a result, also your registration fees and your show entry fees are also part of your business expenses. If you participate in a big sale like the Colorama with ADGA, your proceeds from that are part of your proceeds from the farm. But if you were, like we're doing a calendar this year, our calendar is actually a part of our marketing expenses. So even though we might make some money on this calendar sales, they will actually just defer or counteract the cost of the production, but it may help us in the long run. So those types of sales, whether it's t-shirts or calendars or whatever, those are all marketing and advertising expenses. Your website expenses, even if you have a dedicated camera that you're going to use, not your phone, but a dedicated camera, your barn cam, things like that are all part of your practice of keeping a healthy farm. All right. That includes all of your value-added costs or value-added sales. So your soap, everything else. I mean, I'm making, this year, I'm making beeswax and goat milk candles. My beeswax is coming from another source because our hive is not strong enough to take the wax from. If we are next year able to harvest the wax as well as the honey from our hive, then I will be making goat milk and beeswax candles from our own value-added goods. Also, I'm making sandwich wraps. Those will be made with beeswax, our beeswax, so those are also a value-added product. So you can look at other value addeds that you can use to bring your money in. If you're going to be doing value added, then you also have to look at insurance. And you should look at farm insurance, but you should also look at, does your farm insurance cover your value added products and the liability of your value added products? If you're looking to sell raw milk, there's usually a special insurance policy just for that. Not all insurance carriers will handle raw milk. So you need to check out your farm insurance and make sure they're going to cover everything that you want to cover. It may be your value added. It may be you want to insure your barn, but not your tractor. Maybe you want to insure your barn, but not your livestock. Maybe your livestock, but not your barn. Those are choices you have to make in talking with your insurance agent. But those are all part of the cost of being a farmer. These days, you have to have that. And you need to have liability as well because people don't understand being around farm animals anymore.